cherished and lifted higher every single day. Amen. My beloved family, you are the reason I am here. Every word I write, every story I share, comes from the deepest part of my heart. When you watch till the end, you give life to my hard work. You give meaning to my sacrifice. And you remind me that true family never lets go. To my new family members, please don't doubt, don't leave. Stay with us till the end and you will see. This is more than just a channel. This is your home, your family, your safe place. If your heart is true, right, present. If your love is real, right, I am with Mr. Peter. The church bells had fallen silent, but Zoe Weaver's heart still thundered like a storm trapped in her chest. Ivory silk pooled around her feet as she stood frozen at the altar, 300 pairs of eyes burning into her back. The whispers started as a gentle murmur, then crescendoed into a symphony of pity that made her stomach churn. Garrett was supposed to be here. Garrett was supposed to slide that platinum band onto her finger and promise her forever. Instead, she clutched a bouquet of dying roses while her dreams withered in real time. "Ma'am." The Reverend's voice was gentle, but his eyes held the kind of sorrow reserved for roadkill and broken hearts. "Perhaps we should—" 5 more minutes. Zoe's voice cracked like autumn leaves. She couldn't turn around, couldn't face the sea of sympathetic faces and knowing glances. Her mother's voice echoed from the third pew, something about dignity and moving forward, but the words felt like they were coming from underwater. Then she heard footsteps, measured, confident, approaching from behind. Not Garrett's quick, nervous gait, but something altogether different. Someone altogether different. "Miss Weaver." The voice was warm honey over broken glass, smooth but with an edge that demanded attention. Zoe turned slowly, her veil catching the afternoon light streaming through stained glass windows. The man standing behind her was tall, broad-shouldered, with steel-grey eyes that seemed to see straight through her carefully constructed composure. His dark hair was touched with silver at the temples, and his black suit was tailored with the kind of precision that whispered old money. "I'm Daniel Hopkins," he said quietly, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear, "and I believe we might be able to help each other." Zoe blinked, certain she was hallucinating. "I'm sorry, what?" Daniel stepped closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and woodsy that reminded her of libraries and leather-bound books. "You need a way out of this humiliation. I need a wife. It's a simple business proposition." "A business?" Zoe stared at him, wondering if grief had finally driven her completely insane. "I don't even know you." "You know I'm here when the man you plan to marry isn't." Daniel's eyes flickered toward the watching crowd, then back to her face. "You know I'm offering you an escape from this nightmare, and you know that in about 30 seconds you're going to have to walk back down that aisle alone unless you accept my offer." The truth of his words hit her like ice water. Behind him, she could see Cordelia Banks, her maid of honor, wringing her hands with worry. Her mother was dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. The groomsmen stood awkwardly near the altar, checking their phones and avoiding eye contact. "Why?" she whispered. "Because I need a woman," Daniel said simply, "and you need a home. I can offer you security, respect, and protection from whatever led to this moment. In return, you give me companionship and help me fulfill certain obligations." Zoe felt something shift inside her chest, not hope exactly, but something close to it. "What kind of obligations?" "The kind that require a family, the kind that my lawyers and my dead brothers will insist upon." His voice softened marginally. "I have an 8-year-old niece who needs stability. She needs a mother figure, not just an uncle who works too much and doesn't understand braids or bedtime stories." For a moment, Zoe forgot about the watching crowd, forgot about Garrett's betrayal, forgot about everything except the quiet desperation in this stranger's eyes. It mirrored her own so perfectly it was almost frightening. You're serious, she breathed. Deadly serious. My car is outside. We can go to the courthouse right now, sign the papers, and by tonight you'll be Mrs. Hopkins with a roof over your head and a bank account that will never leave you stranded again. Daniel extended his hand, palm up. Or you can walk down that aisle alone and figure out what comes next on your own. Zoe stared at his hand. It was strong, with long fingers and a simple platinum watch that probably cost more than her teaching salary. No wedding ring, she noticed, no tan line where one had been. I don't love you, she said, testing the words. I don't love you either, Daniel replied without hesitation. But I respect you enough to offer you honesty instead of false promises. What I'm offering is partnership, security, and the chance to help a little girl who's lost everything. What I'm not offering is hearts and flowers and fairy tale endings. The irony wasn't lost on her. Standing in a church decorated for a fairy tale wedding, wearing a dress that cost 3 months' salary, being offered a marriage without love by a man whose eyes held more sincerity than her fiancé's ever had. If I say yes, Zoe said slowly, what happens next? Next, you take my arm. We walk out of here together. I introduce you to Evangeline, my niece, and we start building something real, something honest. Daniel's voice dropped to a whisper. Something better than whatever you were settling for before. The truth of that statement knocked the breath from her lungs. She had been settling for Garrett's lukewarm affection, his casual indifference to her dreams, his assumption that she'd always be there waiting while he figured out what he really wanted. She'd been so afraid of being alone that she'd accepted crumbs instead of demanding the feast she deserved. Behind her, someone coughed. The Reverend was still waiting, Bible in hand, looking increasingly uncomfortable. 300 guests were getting restless, checking their watches and whispering behind programs. Mrs. Hopkins, Zoe said, testing how it sounded. It felt foreign on her tongue, but not unpleasant. That has a nice ring to it. Daniel's lips curved in what might have been a smile. So you'll do it? Zoe looked at his offered hand one more time. It was steady, unwavering, nothing like the trembling mess her own hands had become. She thought about going home to her empty apartment, facing her mother's questions, dealing with the cancelled reservations and returned gifts. She thought about Monday morning, walking into Jefferson Elementary, and facing her colleagues' sympathetic looks and whispered conversations. Or she could take this man's hand and step into something unknown, but undeniably better than the wreckage of her current life. Yes, she breathed, placing her palm against his. Yes, I'll marry you. Daniel's fingers closed around hers, warm and solid and reassuring. Then let's go get married, Miss Weaver. For real this time. He turned toward the crowd, and Zoe turned with him, her hand still clasped in his. The whispers stopped abruptly as 300 people held their collective breath. Ladies and gentlemen, Daniel said, his voice carrying easily through the sudden silence, there's been a change of plans. Miss Weaver and I will be married today, just as scheduled. Reverend Morrison, if you would do us the honor. The Reverend blinked rapidly, clearly trying to process this unexpected turn of events. Well, do you have a license? We'll get one, Daniel said calmly. But first, if you wouldn't mind pronouncing our intention to marry before these witnesses, we'd be grateful. Zoe felt like she was floating outside her body, watching someone else's life unfold. But for the first time in months, she wasn't anxious about the future. She was curious about it. Do you, Daniel Hopkins, take this woman to be your wife? The Reverend asked, clearly improvising. I do, Daniel said, his eyes never leaving Zoe's face. And do you, Zoe Weaver, take this man to be your husband? Zoe looked into Daniel's steel-grey eyes and saw something she'd never seen in Garrett's: absolute certainty. This man knew exactly what he wanted and wasn't afraid to claim it. I do, she whispered. The Reverend smiled, the first genuine expression she'd seen from him all day. Then, by the power vested in me, and pending the proper legal documentation, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." Daniel stepped closer, his free hand rising to cup her cheek. "May I?" he asked softly. Zoe nodded, and he leaned down, pressing his lips to hers in a kiss that was gentle, respectful, and somehow more meaningful than any she'd ever shared with Garrett. It tasted like new beginnings and unspoken promises. When they broke apart, the church erupted in confused but enthusiastic applause. Daniel tucked her hand into the crook of his arm and led her down the aisle, past the shocked faces and whispered questions, toward the heavy wooden doors and whatever waited beyond them. "No regrets?" he asked as they reached the threshold. Zoe looked back once at the life she was leaving behind, then forward at the man beside her. "None," she said, and meant it completely. Chapter 2. The Terms. The Savannah County Courthouse tasted like old coffee and broken dreams, but Zoe had never felt more awake in her life. Daniel sat beside her in the vinyl chairs outside the marriage license office, his presence both comforting and terrifying. He'd removed his jacket during the drive from the church, and she could see the way his shirt stretched across his shoulders, the careful way he held himself like a man accustomed to being watched and measured. Having second thoughts. His voice held no judgment, only quiet curiosity. "Third and fourth thoughts," Zoe admitted, smoothing her wedding dress over her knees. The ivory silk seemed absurd in the fluorescent lighting, like wearing a ball gown to buy groceries. "But not about leaving, never about leaving." Daniel nodded as if he understood completely. "Garrett Morrison. I did some research during the drive." Zoe's stomach clenched. "Research? Insurance adjuster, decent salary, nothing spectacular, filed for bankruptcy 2 years ago but recovered. Recently opened 3 new credit cards and maxed them out." Daniel's voice was matter-of-fact, but his eyes were gentle. "I'm guessing he left you holding the financial responsibility for this wedding." Heat flooded Zoe's cheeks. The dress, the flowers, the reception. "I thought we were building a life together. I thought." She stopped, unable to voice how naive she'd been. "You thought love meant partnership. You weren't wrong to expect that." Daniel leaned back in his chair, studying her profile. For what it's worth, his loss is immeasurable. Something warm unfurled in Zoe's chest at his words, not attraction exactly, but recognition. This man saw her clearly, without the rose-colored glasses of infatuation or the cruel clarity of rejection. "Tell me about Evangeline," she said, needing to focus on something other than her own wounded pride. Daniel's entire demeanor softened at the mention of his niece. "She's 8, brilliant, stubborn, afraid of thunderstorms and anyone who isn't me or Serafina, our housekeeper. Her parents, my brother Alexander and his wife Lillian, died in a car accident 13 months ago. She's been living with me since. That must be incredibly difficult for both of you." "I'm not father material," Daniel said simply. "I work 18-hour days, I travel constantly for business, and I have no idea how to braid hair or help with homework. Evangeline deserves better than a distracted uncle who hired a nanny because he doesn't know how to cook anything besides scrambled eggs." Zoe heard the self-recrimination in his voice and felt an unexpected urge to comfort him. "Grief doesn't come with an instruction manual. You're doing the best you can." "Am I?" "She barely speaks to me. She won't let me read her bedtime stories. She flinches when I try to hug her goodnight." Daniel rubbed his forehead, and for the first time, Zoe saw cracks in his composed facade. "My brother's will requires that I provide a stable family environment for Evangeline or forfeit guardianship to her maternal grandmother, who lives in Seattle and barely remembers her existence." Understanding dawned. "That's why you need a wife. That's why I need a partner. Someone who can love that little girl the way she deserves to be loved." someone who can teach me how to be the guardian she needs. Daniel turned to face her fully. I won't lie to you, Zoe. I'm offering you a business arrangement, but Evangeline isn't part of the business. She's a child who's lost everything, and she needs someone who will choose to love her. The weight of what he was asking settled on Zoe's shoulders. Not just marriage to a stranger, but motherhood to a grieving child. The responsibility was enormous, terrifying, and somehow exactly what her heart had been searching for without knowing it. What are your expectations? She asked carefully. Complete honesty, always. Daniel's grey eyes were steady on hers. We'll live in the same house, share meals, present a united front for Evangeline. You'll have your own suite of rooms, your own space, your own privacy. I won't expect or demand physical intimacy, but I will expect emotional partnership in raising her. Zoe felt relief and something that might have been disappointment. And what about other relationships? There won't be any, for either of us. Marriage is marriage, even if it begins as an arrangement. Daniel's voice was firm. I won't humiliate you by keeping mistresses, and I'll expect the same discretion from you. If either of us wants out, we discuss it honestly and handle it with dignity. How long is this arrangement supposed to last? Until Evangeline is 18 and no longer needs legal guardianship, or until one of us wants something different. Daniel paused. I hope we can become friends, Zoe, real friends. I hope we can build something good together, even if it's not what either of us originally planned. A clerk called their number, interrupting the conversation. As they stood to approach the window, Daniel caught Zoe's hand. Last chance, he said quietly. No judgment if you want to walk away. Zoe looked at this man who was offering her a life she'd never imagined. Not the fairy tale she'd dreamed of, but something more honest, something real. Let's get married, Daniel Hopkins, she said, squeezing his fingers. For real this time. The paperwork took 20 minutes. Daniel produced identification, financial records, and a driver's license with an address that made the clerk's eyebrows rise. Zoe signed her name in careful script, legally binding herself to a man she'd known for less than 3 hours. When it was done, they walked out into the late afternoon sunlight as husband and wife. Now what? Zoe asked, suddenly aware that she had nowhere to go, no clothes except her wedding dress, no plan beyond this moment. Now we go home, Daniel said, leading her toward a sleek black sedan that probably cost more than she made in 2 years. We introduce you to Evangeline, we have dinner, and we start figuring out how to be a family. Home. The word felt foreign and familiar at the same time. Zoe had lived in the same cramped apartment for 4 years, surrounded by furniture from discount stores and dreams she'd convinced herself were enough. Now she was climbing into luxury leather seats, breathing air that smelled like money and possibility. Are you nervous? Daniel asked as he started the engine. Terrified, Zoe admitted. Are you? More than I've been since the day Alexander died. Daniel's hands were steady on the steering wheel, but she could see the tension in his jaw. Evangeline is going to be confused, maybe upset. She's been through so much change already. Then we'll take it slow. Let her set the pace. Zoe surprised herself with the certainty in her voice. Children are more resilient than we give them credit for, but they're also more perceptive. She'll know if we're not being honest with her. Daniel glanced at her with something like admiration. You sound like you know children. I teach 3rd grade. 8-year-olds are my specialty. For the first time all day, Zoe smiled without forcing it. They see through adult nonsense immediately, but they're also incredibly forgiving if you treat them with respect. Good, Daniel said, and some of the tension left his shoulders, because I have no idea what I'm doing. As they drove through the wrought iron gates of Daniel's estate, Zoe felt her breath catch. The house rose before them like something from a historical novel. 3 stories of warm brick and white columns surrounded by ancient oak trees draped in Spanish moss. Gardens stretched as far as she could see, and she could glimpse the shimmer of a pond in the distance. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It's been in my family for 4 generations. Alexander was supposed to inherit it, supposed to fill it with children and laughter." Daniel's voice grew quiet. "Now it's just me and Evangeline, rattling around in 12,000 square feet like ghosts." Zoe heard the loneliness in his words and felt an unexpected kinship. She knew what it was like to live in spaces too big for the dreams they held. "Not anymore," she said softly. "Now it's the 3 of us." Daniel parked in the circular drive and came around to open her door, offering his hand as she stepped out. The gesture was old-fashioned and courtly, and it made something flutter in her chest. "Ready to meet your new daughter?" he asked. Zoe looked up at the house that was now her home, thought about the child waiting inside who was now her responsibility, and felt a calm she hadn't experienced in months settle over her. "Ready?" she said, and let her husband lead her home. Chapter 3. First Impressions. The foyer of Daniel Hopkins's ancestral home whispered secrets of old money and older sorrows. Zoe stood on marble floors that gleamed like midnight water, surrounded by oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors and crystal chandeliers that caught the evening light like captured stars. Everything was beautiful, tasteful, and utterly intimidating. She felt like an intruder in her wedding dress, a discount store bride in a palace built for queens. "Master Daniel?" A warm voice called from the curved staircase, and Zoe looked up to see a woman descending with the grace of someone who belonged in such surroundings. She was perhaps 60, with silver-streaked hair pulled into an elegant chignon and kind brown eyes that took in Zoe's appearance without judgment. "Serafina, I'd like you to meet my wife, Zoe Hopkins." Daniel's voice held a note of pride that surprised her. "Zoe, this is Serafina Mills, who runs this house with more skill than I run my companies." Serafina's eyebrows rose slightly, but her smile was genuine as she reached the bottom of the stairs. "Mrs. Hopkins, what a pleasure. Though I must say this is quite a surprise." "For all of us," Zoe said, accepting the older woman's offered hand. "I hope I'm not causing too much disruption." "Disruption?" Serafina laughed, a sound like silver bells. "Child, this house has been too quiet for too long. A little disruption might be exactly what we need." She studied Zoe's face with sharp intelligence. "Though you look like you could use some tea and a moment to catch your breath." "That sounds perfect," Zoe admitted. "But first, where is Evangeline?" "In the garden," Daniel said, his expression growing tender. "She goes there when she needs to think. It was her mother's favorite place." Serafina's eyes softened. "She's been out there since you left for the church this morning. Augustus took her some milk and cookies an hour ago, but she barely touched them." "Augustus?" Zoe asked. "Our butler. He's been with the family since before Daniel was born." Serafina gestured toward the back of the house. "Shall we?" "The garden is beautiful at this time of day." They walked through rooms that seemed to flow like water. A sitting room with seafoam green walls and antique furniture, a library with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and the smell of leather and old paper, a dining room dominated by a mahogany table that could seat 20. Everything was pristine, perfectly maintained, and somehow sad. "It's lovely," Zoe said, meaning it. "But it feels empty," Daniel finished. "I know, it wasn't always like this. When Alexander and Lillian were alive, when they'd visit with Evangeline, the house felt different, warmer." They stepped through French doors onto a stone terrace, and Zoe's breath caught. The garden spread before them like a living painting, formal flower beds giving way to wild meadows, ancient trees creating secret groves, and winding paths that disappeared around corners heavy with mystery. and there, on a swing hung from a massive oak tree, sat a small figure in a yellow dress. Evangeline Hopkins was beautiful in the way of all heartbroken children, delicate features made older by grief, dark hair that needed a mother's gentle hand, and brown eyes that held too much knowledge for 8 years old. She sat perfectly still on the swing, not pumping her legs or playing, just watching the world with the gravity of someone who'd learned too early that good things could disappear without warning. "She looks like Lillian," Daniel said quietly. "Same eyes, same stubborn chin." "She looks lonely," Zoe observed, her teacher's heart recognizing the particular stillness of a child trying to make herself invisible. "Evangeline," Daniel called softly, "there's someone I'd like you to meet." The little girl's head turned toward them, and Zoe felt her heart clench at the careful blankness in those brown eyes. This was a child who'd learned to protect herself by feeling nothing. "Hello, sweetheart," Zoe said, approaching slowly and speaking in the gentle voice she used with her most fragile students. "I'm Zoe." Evangeline's gaze flicked between Zoe and Daniel, taking in the wedding dress with sharp intelligence. "You got married," she said to Daniel, her voice matter-of-fact but wary. "Yes, we did." Daniel sat on the grass beside the swing, bringing himself to Evangeline's eye level. "Zoe is my wife now, which means she's part of our family." "Is she going to live here?" Evangeline asked, still not looking directly at Zoe. "If that's all right with you," Zoe said, crouching down so she wasn't towering over the child. "This is your home, and I'm the newcomer. I want to make sure you're comfortable with the arrangement." Evangeline's eyes widened slightly, clearly not expecting to be consulted about adult decisions. "You don't look like Uncle Daniel's other girlfriend." "Evangeline," Daniel warned gently, but Zoe held up a hand. "What did his other girlfriend look like?" she asked with genuine curiosity. "Tall, blonde, mean to Augustus when she thought Uncle Daniel wasn't listening." Evangeline's voice was matter-of-fact. "She called this house a money pit and said I should be in boarding school." Zoe felt a flash of anger at this unknown woman who'd been cruel to a grieving child. "Well, I'm not tall or blonde, and I think Augustus sounds lovely. As for boarding school," she pretended to consider it seriously. "Do they have gardens at boarding school?" "I don't think so," Evangeline said uncertainly. "Then boarding school is definitely out. Gardens are very important." Zoe glanced around at the beautiful landscaping. "This is the most wonderful garden I've ever seen. Did you help plant any of it?" For the first time, Evangeline's careful mask slipped slightly. "Mama and I planted the roses by the gazebo last spring, before ... She stopped, the shutters coming down again. "Before the accident," Zoe said gently. "It's okay to talk about your mama, sweetheart. She was very important to you." Evangeline stared at her for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether this stranger could be trusted with something so precious. "She said the roses would bloom every year, even when we weren't here to see them." She was right. Love planted them, so they'll keep blooming. Zoe felt tears prick her eyes at the child's quiet pain. "Would you show me the roses sometime? I'd love to see what you and your mama created together." Something shifted in Evangeline's expression, not trust exactly, but the possibility of it. "I guess, if you want." "I would want that very much." Zoe stood slowly, not wanting to rush this fragile moment. "But right now, I think Serafina mentioned something about tea, and I'm still wearing this ridiculous dress. Maybe we could all have dinner together later. I'd love to hear about school and your friends and whatever else you'd like to tell me." "You're not going to try to be my new mama?" Evangeline asked bluntly. The question hit Zoe like a physical blow. She could see Daniel tense beside her, waiting for her answer. This was the moment of truth, the choice between pretty lies and difficult honesty. "No, sweetheart. I could never replace your mama. and I wouldn't want to try. She was special and perfect and yours." Zoe chose her words carefully. "But I could be your friend if you'd like. I could be someone who cares about you and wants to help take care of you, someone who'll always tell you the truth and always have time to listen." Evangeline considered this, swinging slightly as she thought. Friends can live in the same house. "The very best friends do," Zoe said with a smile. "Okay," Evangeline said finally. "We can try being friends." It wasn't a declaration of love, but it was a beginning. And sometimes, Zoe thought as she followed Daniel and his niece back toward the house, beginnings were more precious than endings because they held infinite possibility. "That was well done," Daniel said quietly as they walked, Evangeline skipping ahead of them toward the terrace. "She's a remarkable child, wise beyond her years, but still so young underneath all that protective armor." Zoe watched the little girl's yellow dress flutter in the evening breeze. "She's going to be just fine, Daniel. She just needs time to trust that good things can stay." "And you?" Daniel asked, something unreadable in his voice. "What do you need?" Zoe considered the question as they climbed the terrace steps, leaving the garden and its secrets behind. What did she need? A week ago, she would have said she needed Garrett to love her enough to show up. An hour ago, she would have said she needed safety and security. But now, watching Evangeline disappear into the house that was now her home, seeing the way Daniel's shoulders had relaxed when his niece smiled, feeling the settled contentment in her own chest. "I think I need exactly what I have," she said softly. "A chance to be part of something real." Daniel stopped walking and looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Even though it's not what you planned." Zoe thought about the church, about Garrett's empty promises, about the life she'd been settling for without realizing how small it was. Then she looked at this beautiful house, this complicated man, this wounded child who might learn to love her if she proved herself worthy of trust. "Especially because it's not what I planned," she said, and meant every word. Chapter 4. Unexpected Depths. Thunder rolled across the Georgia sky like God rearranging furniture, and Zoe Hopkins discovered that her new home had a voice. She'd been living at the estate for 3 days, settling into routines that felt both foreign and oddly natural. Breakfast with Evangeline in the morning sunroom, afternoons exploring the grounds while Daniel worked in his study, evenings where they all gathered for dinner and carefully polite conversation. It was civilized, comfortable, and completely lacking in the electric tension she'd expected from living with a stranger. Until tonight, when the storm arrived. Zoe stood at the tall windows of her suite, watching lightning illuminate the garden in stark black and white. The rain was coming down in sheets, turning the elegant landscaping into something wild and primal. She'd changed from her dinner dress into comfortable pajamas, soft cotton pants and a tank top that made her feel more like herself than the careful outfits she'd been choosing for family meals. A knock at her door interrupted her storm watching. She opened it to find Daniel, still in his white shirt from dinner, but with the sleeves rolled up and the collar unbuttoned. His hair was slightly mussed, as if he'd been running his hands through it. "I wanted to check on you," he said, his voice oddly formal. "The storms here can be intense if you're not used to them." "I'm fine," Zoe assured him, stepping back to let him enter. "Actually, I love thunderstorms. There's something about the raw power that's almost cleansing." Daniel moved to stand beside her at the window, and she caught his scent. That expensive cologne mixed with something uniquely him. Most people find them frightening. "I'm not most people." The words came out more challenging than she'd intended, and Daniel turned to look at her with raised eyebrows. "No," he said slowly, his grey eyes studying her face in the intermittent lightning. "You're not, are you?" There was something different about him tonight. The careful politeness that had characterized their interactions was replaced by something more direct, more real. Maybe it was the storm, or maybe it was the fact that they were alone in her private space for the first time since their wedding. "How is Evangeline handling the thunder?" Zoe asked, needing to focus on something safe. "That's actually why I came to find you." Daniel's expression grew concerned. "She's terrified of storms, has been since the accident. It was raining that night. Usually she ends up in my room, but tonight she asked for you specifically." Warmth flooded Zoe's chest. In 3 days, Evangeline had been polite but distant, accepting her presence without embracing it. The fact that she was asking for comfort felt like a precious gift. Where is she now? Her room. Augustus is with her, but she's asking for Miss Zoe and won't be consoled. Daniel's voice held a note of something that might have been hurt. "She's never asked for me during storms." Zoe heard the pain he was trying to hide and felt an unexpected surge of protectiveness. "Daniel, you've been her anchor through the worst year of her life. The fact that she feels safe enough to ask for someone else just means she's starting to heal. Or it means I'm failing her." "Stop." Zoe turned to face him fully, surprised by the self-doubt in his voice. "You've given her stability, security, and unconditional love. She knows you'll always be there for her. Now she's testing whether I will be too." Lightning flashed again, followed immediately by a crack of thunder that seemed to shake the house. From somewhere down the hall came the sound of a child crying. "Let's go," Zoe said, already moving toward the door. They found Evangeline in her bedroom, a confection of pink and white that somehow managed to be elegant rather than gaudy. The little girl was huddled under her covers with Augustus, the elderly butler, sitting beside her bed, reading from a worn copy of Charlotte's Web in his cultured British accent. "Miss Zoe!" Evangeline sat up as they entered, her face tear-streaked but relieved. "You came." "Of course I came, sweetheart." Zoe settled on the edge of the bed, and Evangeline immediately scrambled into her lap. "Augustus, thank you for staying with her." The elderly man rose with dignity, closing the book. "My pleasure, madam. Young miss has been quite brave, haven't you, dear?" Evangeline nodded against Zoe's shoulder, and Augustus excused himself with a gentle pat to the child's head. Daniel lingered in the doorway, looking uncertain. "Would you like Uncle Daniel to stay too?" Zoe asked softly. "Yes, please," Evangeline whispered. Daniel's face brightened, and he settled into the reading chair beside the bed. For a moment, they were almost like a real family, mother and father comforting their frightened child during a storm. "Want to tell me what makes the thunder so scary?" Zoe asked, smoothing Evangeline's dark hair. "It sounds like the night Mama and Daddy died," Evangeline said in a small voice. "The policeman said it was raining really hard and they couldn't see. The thunder sounds like car crashes." Zoe's heart broke for this child who associated natural beauty with devastating loss. She looked over Evangeline's head at Daniel, who was staring at his hands with an expression of profound grief. "You know what I think about when I hear thunder," Zoe said, making her voice gentle but confident. "I think about how brave the earth is." Evangeline pulled back to look at her. "Brave? Think about it. The earth holds all of us, all the time. All the people and animals and trees and buildings. That's a big responsibility. And sometimes, when the weight gets too heavy or the job gets too hard, the earth needs to cry." "The earth cries?" Evangeline's eyes were wide. "The rain is earth tears, and the thunder. That's the earth stretching, making room for new growth, new life. It sounds scary, but it's really just the sound of the world making itself bigger and stronger." Zoe hugged the little girl closer. "Just like you're doing, getting bigger and stronger every day." Evangeline considered this, her head tilted thoughtfully. So the thunder isn't angry? Not angry, just powerful. Like love is powerful. Sometimes love is quiet, like Uncle Daniel reading you bedtime stories. And sometimes love is loud, like thunder announcing that something important is happening. Lightning lit up the room again, followed by a rumble of thunder that seemed less menacing now, more like a giant clearing his throat. "Will you stay until it stops?" Evangeline asked. "As long as you need me to," Zoe promised. They settled back against the pillows. Evangeline curled between Zoe and Daniel and talked softly about small things, school and friends and favorite colors, while the storm gradually moved away. Zoe found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't since arriving at the estate, her body fitting naturally against the curve of the bed, her voice blending easily with Daniel's as they told Evangeline stories about thunderstorms they'd weathered as children. "My grandmother used to say that storms were nature's way of rearranging the world," Daniel said, his voice warm with memory, making space for new possibilities. "I like that," Evangeline said sleepily. "Maybe the storm tonight is making space for Miss Zoe to really be part of our family." The simple words hit Zoe with unexpected force. She looked across Evangeline's drowsing form at Daniel and found him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Gratitude, certainly, but something else too. Something that made her pulse quicken and her breath catch. "Maybe it is," Daniel said softly. And Zoe had the distinct feeling he wasn't just talking to Evangeline. When the child finally fell asleep, they carefully extracted themselves from the bed. Daniel tucked the covers around his niece with gentle hands, and Zoe found herself thinking that this man who claimed not to be father material was exactly the kind of father every child deserved. They walked quietly back down the hall, the storm now just a gentle patter of rain against the windows. When they reached Zoe's door, Daniel stopped. "Thank you," he said simply, "for what you did in there. The way you made her feel safe without dismissing her fears." "She's easy to love," Zoe replied, then felt heat rise in her cheeks at the admission. "Is she?" Daniel stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his grey eyes. "What about the rest of us? Are we easy to love too?" The question hung between them like a challenge or an invitation. Zoe felt the careful boundaries they'd established beginning to blur, replaced by something more dangerous and infinitely more appealing. "I don't know yet," she said honestly, "but I'm beginning to think I'd like to find out." Daniel's eyes darkened, and for a moment Zoe thought he might kiss her. Instead, he reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "Good night, Zoe Hopkins," he said, his voice rough with something that might have been restraint. "Good night, Daniel." She watched him walk away, her cheek still tingling from his touch, and realized that somewhere between the thunder and Evangeline's sleepy trust, their marriage of convenience had begun to feel like something else entirely. Something real. Something worth fighting for. Something that might actually become the love story she'd always dreamed of, even if it was nothing like what she'd planned. Chapter 5. Hidden Truths. The scent of jasmine and old secrets drifted through the morning air as Zoe discovered the truth behind Daniel's desperate proposal. She'd been living in the Hopkins estate for 2 weeks, falling into rhythms that felt surprisingly natural. Evangeline had begun seeking her out for bedtime stories and scraped-knee comfort, while Daniel had grown more relaxed in her presence, sharing coffee in the garden and quiet conversations about books and dreams. It felt like the beginning of something real, something precious, until she found the legal documents. Zoe hadn't meant to pry. She'd been looking for stationery in Daniel's study to write thank-you notes for the wedding gifts that kept arriving, addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Hopkins from friends and business associates who had no idea their marriage was anything other than a love match. The desk drawer had been slightly open, and when she'd tried to close it, a folder had fallen to the floor, spilling its contents across the Persian rug. Now she stood frozen, reading words that made her stomach churn with betrayal. Custody challenge filed by Helena Morrison. The date was 3 weeks before their wedding. 3 weeks before Daniel had appeared at the church with his convenient proposal. Her hands shook as she read further. Evangeline's maternal grandmother wasn't the distant figure Daniel had described. She was a retired child psychologist living in Seattle who had petitioned the courts for custody, claiming that Daniel's bachelor lifestyle and frequent travel made him an unfit guardian. The challenge specifically cited his relationship with Isadora Blackwell, the tall blonde woman Evangeline had mentioned, and the instability it created in the child's life. The minor child would benefit from a traditional family structure with married parents, the document read. Mr. Hopkins' current living situation provides no female role model or stable family environment. Zoe sank into Daniel's leather chair, the papers scattered around her like evidence of a crime. He hadn't just needed a wife, he'd needed her specifically, a black woman to marry a biracial child's white guardian, presenting a united family front that courts would find harder to challenge. Her teaching background, her maternal instincts, even her abandoned status at the altar, it all made her the perfect candidate for his purposes. Mrs. Hopkins? Augustus appeared in the doorway, his expression carefully neutral. "I've brought your morning tea." Zoe looked up at the elderly butler, wondering how much he knew about the web of deception surrounding her marriage. "Augustus, how long have Helena Morrison's lawyers been circling?" If he was surprised by her knowledge, he didn't show it. Augustus set the tea tray on a side table and studied her with eyes that had seen decades of family secrets. "Since Master Alexander's funeral, madam." She's never forgiven Master Daniel for what she perceives as his role in the accident. "What role?" Zoe's voice was sharper than she intended. Master Daniel was supposed to drive them that night, a business dinner that ran late. Master Alexander offered to take Miss Lillian himself, rather than wait. Augustus's voice grew soft with old grief. "Mrs. Morrison blames Master Daniel for not being there, though heaven knows he's blamed himself far more." The tea grew cold as Zoe processed this information. Daniel carried guilt about his brother's death, faced legal challenges to his guardianship, and needed a wife to secure Evangeline's future. Enter Zoe Weaver, conveniently heartbroken and desperate, with all the right qualifications to solve his problems. "Does he love her?" she asked quietly. "Evangeline, I mean. Not as obligation or duty, but really love her." "With every breath in his body," Augustus said without hesitation. "That child is his heart walking around outside his chest. He'd burn down the world before letting anyone take her away." "And me?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. "What am I to him?" Augustus studied her for a long moment, his expression kind but unflinching. "That, madam, is a question only Master Daniel can answer. But if I may say so, I've never seen him look at Miss Isadora the way he looks at you." Before Zoe could ask what he meant, footsteps echoed in the hallway. She quickly gathered the scattered papers, shoving them back into the folder just as Daniel appeared in the doorway. "Good morning," he said, his face lighting up at the sight of her. "I was hoping we could—" He stopped, noticing the folder in her hands. His expression shifted from warmth to wary concern. "What are you reading?" Zoe stood slowly, the folder clutched against her chest like a shield. "The truth, apparently. Something you should have shared with me before I agreed to marry you." Daniel's face went carefully blank, the expression she now recognized as his defense mechanism. "Zoe, I can explain." "Can you?" "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you deliberately withheld information that was crucial to my decision." She held up the folder. "Helena Morrison isn't some distant relative who barely remembers Evangeline exists. She's a child psychologist with a legitimate custody challenge who specifically cited your lack of a stable family structure." Yes, Daniel said simply. That's all true. His calm admission somehow hurt worse than denial would have. So you found yourself a convenient bride, someone desperate enough to say yes, qualified enough to look good in court, and naive enough not to ask too many questions. That's not... Daniel started forward, then stopped when she stepped back. Yes, I needed a wife. Yes, your background and circumstances made you an ideal candidate, but that's not why I married you. Then why? The question came out raw, painful. And don't tell me it was love at first sight, because we both know that's a lie. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, studying her face as if memorizing it. When he spoke, his voice was soft and absolutely honest. Because when I saw you standing at that altar, betrayed and humiliated but still holding your head high, I recognized something in you that I'd been searching for without knowing it. He moved closer, slowly, as if approaching a wounded animal. Strength. Dignity. The kind of courage that doesn't break even when everything falls apart. Pretty words, Zoe said, but her voice lacked conviction. True words. Zoe, I could have married any number of women. I could have paid someone to be my wife, hired an actress to play the part. But I didn't want a performance. I wanted partnership with someone who would love Evangeline genuinely, not because she was paid to care. How do you know I'm not just performing too? How do you know any of this is real? Daniel stepped close enough to touch her, but didn't. Because you asked if Evangeline would be comfortable with the arrangement before you agreed to live here. Because you spent your first week learning all the staff's names and preferences. Because you hold her during thunderstorms and make up stories about brave earth tears, and you do it all without expecting anything in return. Zoe felt tears burning behind her eyes. You should have told me about Helena, about the custody challenge. I had a right to know what I was signing up for. You're right. I should have. Daniel's voice was heavy with regret. I was afraid you'd see it as too much responsibility, too much risk. I was afraid you'd say no. And maybe I would have. Zoe set the folder on his desk with careful precision. Maybe I needed to make that choice with full information instead of letting you decide what I could handle. You're absolutely right. Daniel dragged a hand through his hair, looking suddenly older. I'm sorry, Zoe. I'm sorry for not trusting you with the truth. I'm sorry for putting you in this position without your full consent. The apology was sincere, but it couldn't undo the hurt of discovering how calculated her rescue had been. Zoe moved toward the door, needing space to think, to process the complicated emotions churning in her chest. Zoe, please. Daniel's voice stopped her at the threshold. Don't let my mistakes hurt Evangeline. Whatever you decide about us, about this marriage, please don't leave her. She's already lost too much. Zoe turned back to look at him. This man who'd become her husband under false pretenses, but whose love for his niece was absolutely genuine. Do you really think I'd punish a child for your choices? No, Daniel said quietly. I think you're better than that. Better than me. I'm not leaving, Daniel. Not Evangeline, and not you. Zoe squared her shoulders, decision crystallizing in her mind. But things are going to change between us. No more secrets, no more careful politeness. If we're going to make this work, really work, it has to be built on honesty. Relief flooded Daniel's features. Whatever you want, whatever you need. What I want is the truth, always. What I need is time to figure out how I feel about being your convenient solution instead of your chosen partner. Zoe paused at the door. And what I'm hoping for is the chance to discover whether this arrangement can become something real. She left him standing in his study, surrounded by the scattered evidence of his deception and the promise of something better. As she walked toward the garden where Evangeline was playing, Zoe realized that despite everything, she wasn't angry anymore. She was determined to build something authentic from the foundation of their false beginning, determined to prove that love could grow from the most practical of soil, and determined to make Daniel Hopkins fall in love with her for real this time, not because he needed a wife, but because he couldn't imagine his life without her in it. Chapter 6. Dangerous Visitors. The past arrived at the Hopkins estate on a Tuesday morning, wearing a designer suit and carrying a dozen white roses. Zoe was in the garden with Evangeline, helping the little girl tend to the memorial roses her mother had planted when Augustus appeared on the terrace with an expression of barely concealed distaste. "Mrs. Hopkins, there's a gentleman here to see you, a Mr. Garrett Ashford." The trowel slipped from Zoe's suddenly nerveless fingers. Evangeline looked up from the roses, sensing the shift in atmosphere with the intuition of a child who'd learned to read adult emotions for survival. "Did I do something wrong, Miss Zoe?" she asked, her voice small. "No, sweetheart, nothing at all." Zoe forced a smile, her mind racing. Why was Garrett here? How had he even found her? "Augustus, please ask Mr. Ashford to wait in the front parlour. I'll be there shortly." "Very good, madam." Augustus hesitated. "Shall I inform Master Daniel?" "No." The word came out sharper than intended. Whatever Garrett wanted, she could handle it herself. "Thank you, Augustus. Just give me a few minutes." After the butler disappeared, Zoe turned to Evangeline, who was watching her with worried brown eyes. "Who's Mr. Ashford?" the little girl asked. Zoe knelt beside her, choosing her words carefully. "Someone I used to know, before I married your uncle. He's probably just coming to congratulate us on our marriage." It was a lie, and they both knew it. But Evangeline nodded solemnly, accepting the fiction for what it was, an adult way of saying some conversations weren't meant for young ears. "Will you be okay by yourself for a little while?" Zoe asked. "Augustus can watch me," Evangeline said. "But Miss Zoe, if that man makes you sad, you can tell Uncle Daniel. He's very good at making sad people feel better." The simple wisdom from an 8-year-old made Zoe's throat tight. "Thank you, sweetheart. I'll remember that." She found Garrett in the front parlour, standing before the massive portrait of Daniel's grandfather and looking thoroughly intimidated by his surroundings. He'd always been handsome in a conventional way, blonde hair styled just so, blue eyes that women found appealing, a smile that promised easy charm. But seeing him in Daniel's home, surrounded by 4 generations of quiet dignity, he looked diminished somehow. Smaller. "Hello, Garrett." Zoe kept her voice level, professional. "This is unexpected." He turned at the sound of her voice, and his face lit up with the boyish grin that had once made her heart flutter. Now it just made her tired. "Zoe, God, you look incredible. Marriage obviously agrees with you." His eyes swept over her appreciatively, taking in the simple sundress and gardening gloves she'd forgotten to remove. "Though I have to say, when I heard you'd married Daniel Hopkins 3 hours after our wedding was supposed to happen, I could hardly believe it." "And yet, here you are," Zoe observed. "I assume this isn't a social call." "Actually, it is." Garrett moved closer, and she caught the scent of his cologne, something aggressive and cloying that made her remember why she'd started getting headaches during their relationship. "I came to apologize, and to explain." "There's nothing to explain. You didn't want to marry me. Message received loud and clear." "That's not true." Garrett reached for her hands, and she stepped back, bumping into a mahogany side table. "I got scared, okay? Cold feet. It happens to everyone." "Cold feet?" Zoe stared at him in disbelief. "You left me standing at the altar in front of 300 people. That's not cold feet, Garrett. That's cruelty." I know, it was awful of me." He ran a hand through his perfect hair, mussing it just enough to look attractively disheveled. "But Zoe, think about it. If I'd gone through with the wedding when I wasn't ready, when I had doubts, wouldn't that have been worse?" Wouldn't that have been lying to you? The audacity of his logic took her breath away. You think abandoning me at the altar was somehow more honest than having a conversation about your concerns? I panicked, I admit it, but seeing you now, seeing how well you're doing. Garrett gestured around the elegant room. Maybe it all worked out for the best. You clearly traded up. Something cold and furious unfurled in Zoe's chest. Traded up? Come on, Zoe. Look at this place. Look at the car in the driveway, the staff, the grounds. Hopkins is worth what? 100 million? 200? Garrett's smile turned calculating. I know you well enough to know you didn't marry him for love. Not after 3 hours. So what's the arrangement? What's he getting out of it? That's none of your business, isn't it? We were together for 2 years, Zoe. I know you. I know you're practical, smart, always thinking 3 steps ahead. Garrett moved closer again, and this time she stood her ground. So here's what I think happened. Hopkins needed a wife quickly, probably for legal reasons or business reasons. You needed a soft place to land after I screwed things up. It's perfect. What's your point, Garrett? My point is that it doesn't have to be permanent. You've got your revenge, proved you can land on your feet, maybe even made me a little jealous. His smile turned coaxing, but we both know it's not real. Whatever he's paying you, whatever security he's offering, I can match it. Zoe felt the world tilt slightly, as if she were seeing this conversation from outside her own body. You think Daniel is paying me to be his wife? I think you're both getting something out of this arrangement, and there's nothing wrong with that. But Zoe, we had something real, something that grew over time, built on actual love and understanding. Garrett reached for her again, and this time caught her hands before she could retreat. I've spent the last 2 weeks realizing what a mistake I made, how much I love you, how much I need you in my life. You love me? Zoe's voice was dangerous quiet. Of course I love you. I always have. That's why I got scared. Because what we had was so real, so permanent. I wasn't ready for forever, but I am now. Garrett's thumbs stroked over her knuckles, a gesture that had once soothed her. Come home with me, Zoe. Let's do this right. Let's have the wedding we were supposed to have, the life we planned together. The life where you left me holding $60,000 in wedding debt. The life where you maxed out credit cards in my name and disappeared for 2 weeks. Zoe pulled her hands free, her voice rising. The life where you just assumed I'd be waiting whenever you decided you were ready to grow up? Garrett had the grace to look ashamed. I can explain all of that. I can make it right. No, you can't, because you still don't understand what you did wrong. Zoe moved toward the door, needing distance from his familiar manipulations. You think this is about money, or security, or revenge. You think I married Daniel to make some kind of point to you. Didn't you? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Zoe thought about the past 2 weeks, sharing coffee with Daniel in the morning sunlight, reading bedtime stories to Evangeline, feeling like she belonged somewhere for the first time in her adult life. Had she married Daniel to prove something to Garrett, to herself? Maybe. At first. But that wasn't why she was staying. I married Daniel because he offered me honesty when you gave me lies. I married him because he keeps his promises when you break yours. And I'm staying married to him because what we're building together is more real than anything you and I ever had. Garrett's face darkened. You've known him for 2 weeks, Zoe. 2 weeks. I know his type. Rich, powerful men who collect beautiful things and discard them when they get bored. How long do you think this fantasy is going to last? Longer than our relationship did, apparently. This is ridiculous. Garrett's charm finally cracked, revealing the petulance underneath. You're throwing away 2 years for some billionaire's charity case marriage? You think he actually cares about you? I think, said a new voice from the doorway, that you're overstaying your welcome. Zoe turned to see Daniel standing in the parlor entrance, his expression perfectly controlled, but his eyes blazing with barely contained fury. He was still in his business clothes from whatever meeting he'd left to come home, his tie slightly loosened and his jacket slung over one arm. "Hopkins!" Garrett straightened, trying to reclaim his earlier confidence. "I was just catching up with my fiancée." "Your former fiancée?" Daniel corrected, moving into the room with predatory grace. "Who is now my wife, a fact that makes your presence here both inappropriate and unwelcome. I'm here because Zoe and I have unfinished business." "No," Zoe said firmly, finding her voice again. "We don't. We never did. What we had was finished the moment you decided not to show up for our wedding." Daniel moved to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body, the solid strength of his presence. "You heard my wife. I suggest you leave before I have you escorted off the property." Garrett's eyes flicked between them, clearly searching for cracks in their united front. "This is far from over, Zoe. When you get tired of playing house with your convenience husband, when you remember what real love feels like, you know where to find me." He brushed past them on his way to the door, pausing just long enough to drop his parting shot. "Ask him about Isadora Blackwell sometime. Ask him how long his last convenient relationship lasted before he got bored and moved on." Then he was gone, leaving only the scent of his cologne and the echo of his poisonous words. Daniel and Zoe stood in silence for a long moment, the weight of Garrett's implications settling between them like smoke. "Zoe," Daniel began, his voice careful. "Don't." She held up a hand, her emotions too raw and complicated for analysis. "Just don't. Not right now." She walked out of the parlor, leaving Daniel standing alone among the portraits of his ancestors, and wondered if Garrett might be right about one thing. How long could a marriage built on convenience really last when real feelings started getting in the way? Chapter 7. Shadows of the Past. The ghost of Isadora Blackwell arrived with the evening mail, her photograph smiling mockingly from the society pages of Charleston magazine. Zoe sat in the morning room, supposedly reading while Evangeline practiced piano in the music room down the hall. But the magazine lay open to a full-page spread titled Charleston's Most Eligible Bachelors, featuring a photo from last year's charity gala. There was Daniel in an impeccable tuxedo, looking devastatingly handsome, with his arm around a statuesque blonde who radiated the kind of effortless sophistication that came from generations of good breeding and better investments. "Miss Isadora Blackwell," the caption read, with longtime companion Daniel Hopkins at the Heritage Foundation Gala. Sources close to the couple suggest an engagement announcement is imminent. The magazine was dated 3 months before Daniel's brother died, 3 months before everything in his life changed forever. "Madam?" Serafina appeared in the doorway, her expression carefully neutral. "Master Daniel is on the phone. He's been delayed at his meeting in Atlanta and won't be home for dinner." Zoe forced a smile, closing the magazine with deliberate casualness. "Thank you, Serafina. I'll let Evangeline know." But after the housekeeper left, Zoe found herself staring at the closed magazine, her mind spinning with questions she was afraid to ask. What had happened between Daniel and Isadora? Why had their relationship ended? And why did seeing them together in that photograph make her chest tight with something that felt uncomfortably like jealousy? "Miss Zoe?" Evangeline appeared in the doorway, her dark hair slightly mussed from leaning over the piano keys. "I finished practicing. Want to see what I learned?" "Of course, sweetheart." Zoe tucked the magazine beneath a stack of correspondence and followed Evangeline back to the music room. The little girl had been working on a simple piece, for Elise arranged for beginners, and she played it with the careful concentration of someone determined to get every note right. When she finished, she looked up expectantly. "That was beautiful," Zoe said sincerely. "Your mama would be so proud." Evangeline beamed, but then her expression grew thoughtful. "Miss Zoe, can I ask you something?" "Anything." "Are you and Uncle Daniel going to get divorced?" The question hit Zoe like a physical blow. What? Evangeline, why would you ask that? Because that's what happened to my friend Sophia's parents. First, her daddy started coming home late all the time. Then her mama started being sad and reading magazines instead of paying attention. Then they had lots of talks in quiet voices where they thought she couldn't hear. Evangeline's voice was matter-of-fact, but her eyes held the ancient wisdom of a child who'd learned too early that good things could disappear. And yesterday that man came to see you, and Uncle Daniel was angry, and today Uncle Daniel isn't coming home for dinner. Zoe sank onto the piano bench beside Evangeline, her heart breaking for this perceptive little girl who was watching for signs of abandonment in every interaction. Oh, sweetheart, Uncle Daniel and I are not getting divorced. She pulled Evangeline into her lap, breathing in the sweet scent of her shampoo. Sometimes adults have complicated feelings and need to figure things out, but that doesn't mean we stop caring about each other, and it definitely doesn't mean we stop caring about you. Promise? I promise. Zoe meant it completely. Whatever happened between her and Daniel, she would never abandon this child. You're stuck with me, Evangeline Hopkins. I'm not going anywhere. Evangeline relaxed against her, and they sat quietly for a moment, listening to the settling sounds of the old house around them. Miss Zoe? Evangeline's voice was small. I remember Miss Isadora. Zoe's breath caught, but she kept her voice calm. Do you? She came to dinner sometimes before Mama and Daddy died. She was very beautiful and had pretty clothes, but she didn't like kids very much. Evangeline twisted in Zoe's lap to look at her directly. She told Uncle Daniel that children should be seen and not heard, and that I should eat in the kitchen with Augustus instead of the dining room with the grown-ups. Anger flared in Zoe's chest at the image of this woman dismissing Evangeline like an inconvenience. What did Uncle Daniel say to that? He said that I was family, and family always eats together. Miss Isadora didn't like that very much. Evangeline's voice grew quieter. After Mama and Daddy died and I came to live here, Miss Isadora stopped coming around. I heard Uncle Daniel talking to her on the phone one night, and he was very sad after. People handle grief differently, sweetheart. Sometimes relationships can't survive when everything changes. But you and Uncle Daniel can survive it, right? Because you like me, and you don't think kids should eat in the kitchen. Right, Zoe said firmly, hoping it was true. We can survive anything as long as we stick together. That night, after Evangeline was tucked safely in bed with a story about a brave princess who saved herself, Zoe found herself wandering the halls of the estate. Daniel still wasn't home, and the house felt too big, too empty, too full of shadows and unanswered questions. She ended up in his study, drawn by some masochistic impulse to understand the man she'd married. The room smelled like him, expensive cologne and leather, and something indefinably masculine that made her pulse quicken despite her emotional turmoil. The magazine was still there on his desk, where she'd left it that morning, along with a stack of business correspondence and what looked like legal documents. She told herself she wasn't snooping, just straightening up, but her eyes caught on familiar letterhead. Morrison and Associates, Helena Morrison's lawyers. The document was a formal response to some motion she hadn't seen, but the language was clear enough. Helena Morrison was escalating her custody challenge, questioning the legitimacy of Daniel's sudden marriage and demanding a full psychological evaluation of both Daniel and Zoe as potential guardians. Recent reports suggest that Mr. Hopkins' marriage was contracted solely for the purpose of presenting a more favorable custody arrangement, the document read. The court should investigate whether this union represents a genuine family structure or merely a legal convenience designed to circumvent previous concerns about the minor child's welfare. Zoe sank into Daniel's chair, the implications crashing over her like a cold wave. Someone had been watching them, reporting back to Helena Morrison about their relationship, someone close enough to know details about their marriage, about Daniel's previous relationship with Isadora, about the timing of everything. Find what you were looking for. Zoe spun around to find Daniel standing in the doorway, his tie loosened and his hair disheveled from travel. His expression was unreadable, but there was something dangerous in his voice. I wasn't looking for anything specific. I was just reading my confidential legal correspondence. Daniel moved into the room, his movements controlled but predatory. That's interesting, considering you lectured me about honesty and trust just a few days ago. Heat flooded Zoe's cheeks. You're right, I'm sorry. I had no right to. But now that you have, what do you think? Daniel's voice was cold, professional, nothing like the warm man who'd comforted Evangeline during thunderstorms. Are you ready to discuss strategy with Helena Morrison's legal team? Compare notes about my unsuitability as a guardian? Daniel, stop. Zoe stood, moving around the desk toward him. You know I would never. Do I? Because from where I'm standing it looks like you're having second thoughts about our arrangement. First Garrett shows up offering to rescue you from this terrible mistake. Now you're reading private documents about custody challenges. Daniel's grey eyes were ice cold. Maybe you're starting to wonder if marrying me was such a good idea after all. That's not what this is about. Then what is it about, Zoe? Because I'm getting mixed signals here. One day you're promising Evangeline you'll never leave. The next you're researching ways my ex-girlfriend's lawyers might break us apart. The mention of Isadora hung between them like a sword. Zoe felt her own temper rising, fueled by frustration and something darker. Maybe I'm trying to understand who I really married, she said, her voice sharper than intended. Maybe I'm tired of discovering important information about my own life from legal documents and society magazines. What magazines? Zoe gestured toward the Charleston magazine still lying open on his desk. Congratulations on your impending engagement, by the way. Too bad no one told Isadora that plans had changed. Daniel's face went very still as he looked at the photograph, and something flickered across his expression. Pain, regret, something too complex to name. That picture was taken 8 months ago, he said quietly. The caption suggests an engagement announcement was imminent. What happened, Daniel? Did she leave you when Alexander died and you suddenly had responsibilities? Did she decide a grieving child was too much trouble for Charleston's most eligible bachelor? Stop. Daniel's voice was sharp enough to cut. You don't know what you're talking about. Then tell me. Help me understand why your last relationship ended, why Helena Morrison thinks our marriage is a sham, why I feel like I'm living in a house full of ghosts and secrets. Daniel stared at her for a long moment, his expression cycling through anger, pain, and something that looked almost like defeat. Isadora left because I chose Evangeline over her, he said finally. She wanted me to fight Helena's custody challenge, to prove that I could provide a traditional family structure. She wanted me to send Evangeline to boarding school and continue our life exactly as it had been before Alexander died. And you refused. I told her that Evangeline was my priority, that everything else was negotiable. She said I was choosing a child over our future together. Daniel's voice grew quiet, remembering. I told her that any future worth having would include loving the people who needed us most. Zoe felt her anger deflate like a punctured balloon. She gave you an ultimatum. She gave me a choice. I made it. Daniel looked at her directly, just like I'm asking you to make one now. What choice? Whether you're going to trust me or trust the voices that want to tear us apart, whether you're going to fight for this family we're building or look for reasons to run away when things get complicated. Daniel moved closer, close enough that she could see the exhaustion in his eyes. Because make no mistake, Zoe, Helena Morrison and her lawyers will use everything against us. Every doubt, every argument, every moment of uncertainty will become evidence that we're not a real family. We're not a real family, Zoe said softly. We're two strangers who got married for practical reasons and are trying to figure out how to make it work. Are we? Daniel's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Because it feels real to me. When you hold Evangeline during storms, when you laugh at my terrible jokes over breakfast, when you challenge me to be better than I thought I could be, that feels real. Zoe's heart hammered against her ribs as she looked into his grey eyes, seeing past the carefully controlled exterior to the vulnerable man underneath. Daniel, I know we started this as an arrangement. I know you have every right to doubt my motives, to question whether any of this means something. Daniel reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face in his hands. But I need you to know that what I feel for you now has nothing to do with convenience or legal strategy, or anything except the fact that you've become essential to my happiness. You're saying you love me. The words came out as barely a whisper. I'm saying I'm falling in love with you, and it terrifies me because I know you don't feel the same way. I know you married me to escape Garrett, to find security, to help a child who needed you. Daniel's thumbs brushed across her cheekbones, and she realized she was crying. But I'm hoping that maybe, eventually, you might feel something real for me too. Zoe closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the raw honesty in his voice, by the careful way he held her, as if she were something precious and fragile. I already do, she whispered. That's what scares me. When she opened her eyes, Daniel was looking at her with an expression of wonder and desperate hope. Then fight for us, he said simply. Whatever Helena Morrison throws at us, whatever doubts or fears or ghosts from the past try to tear us apart, fight for us. Zoe thought about Evangeline upstairs, sleeping peacefully, because she finally felt secure. She thought about the warmth of this house, the kindness of the staff, the way Daniel looked at her like she was a miracle he hadn't dared to hope for. She thought about Garrett's cruel words, about Isadora's photograph, about all the voices that wanted to convince her this couldn't be real. And then she thought about the way Daniel's hands felt cradling her face, the way he'd chosen a grieving child over social expectations, the way he'd offered her honesty when her world fell apart. Yes, she said, rising on her toes to press her lips to his. I'll fight for us. The kiss was soft, tentative, a promise rather than a demand. When they broke apart, Daniel rested his forehead against hers. Together, he asked. Together, Zoe confirmed, and meant it with every fiber of her being. Chapter 8. The breaking point crisis arrived on a rain-soaked Thursday evening, hidden in a social worker's briefcase and an 8-year-old's broken trust. Zoe was helping Evangeline with her math homework at the kitchen table when Augustus appeared in the doorway, his usually composed expression troubled. Mrs. Hopkins, there's a Miss Rebecca Sterling from Child Protective Services here to see you and Master Daniel. She's requested to speak with Miss Evangeline as well. The pencil slipped from Evangeline's suddenly slack fingers, clattering onto the hardwood floor like a gunshot. Her brown eyes went wide with the kind of terror reserved for children who'd already lost everything once. Are they taking me away? She whispered. Zoe's heart shattered at the raw fear in the child's voice. No, sweetheart, no one is taking you anywhere. Sometimes social workers visit families just to make sure everyone is happy and healthy. It's routine. But even as she said the words, Zoe knew this was anything but routine. Helena Morrison was escalating her legal challenge, and they were all about to pay the price. Where's Uncle Daniel? Evangeline's voice was small, controlled, the same careful composure she'd worn in the first days after her parents' death. He's in his study on a conference call. Augustus, please ask him to join us in the front parlor, and please show Miss Sterling in. Zoe stood, smoothing her casual clothes and wishing she'd known to dress for battle today. Evangeline, why don't you take your homework upstairs? I'll come check on you in a little while. No. Evangeline's chin set with familiar stubbornness. If they want to talk about me, I should be there. Mama always said I was old enough to hear the truth about things that concerned me. The simple dignity in her voice made Zoe's throat tight. At 8 years old, Evangeline had already learned that knowledge was armor against the worst kind of surprises. All right, Zoe said gently. But if you want to leave at any time, you just tell me, okay? Evangeline nodded solemnly, and they walked together to the front parlor, where a young woman in a business suit was examining the family portraits with professional interest. Miss Sterling, I'm Zoe Hopkins. Zoe extended her hand, noting the social worker's firm grip and assessing gaze. This is Evangeline. Thank you for seeing me on such short notice. Rebecca Sterling's voice was warm but professional, the tone of someone accustomed to delivering difficult news gently. I apologize for the evening visit, but I wanted to speak with all of you together. Daniel appeared in the doorway, his hair slightly mussed from running his hands through it, his tie loosened from whatever stressful call had kept him occupied. When he saw the social worker, his expression shifted to the carefully controlled mask Zoe had learned to recognize as his defense mechanism. Miss Sterling, I presume. I'm Daniel Hopkins. He moved to stand beside Zoe and Evangeline, presenting a united front. I assume this visit concerns the custody petition filed by Helena Morrison. Partly, yes. Miss Sterling settled into one of the antique chairs, her movements deliberate and non-threatening. I've been assigned to conduct a family assessment as part of the court's review process. Mrs. Morrison has raised some concerns about Evangeline's living situation that require investigation. What kind of concerns? Zoe asked, though she suspected she already knew. Miss Sterling consulted her notes, her expression carefully neutral. Questions about the legitimacy and stability of your marriage, Mr. Hopkins, the timing of your wedding, just hours after Mrs. Hopkins was apparently abandoned at the altar by another man, has raised some red flags. Evangeline's sharp intake of breath was audible in the suddenly tense room. Zoe felt heat flood her cheeks, but she kept her voice steady. Our marriage may have begun unconventionally, but it's completely legal and increasingly loving. The circumstances of our meeting don't change our commitment to each other or to Evangeline. I understand that perspective, Mrs. Hopkins. However, I've also received reports suggesting that your relationship may be primarily transactional in nature. Miss Sterling's voice remained gentle, but her words hit like bullets. Can you help me understand the nature of your living arrangements? Do you and Mr. Hopkins share a bedroom? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Zoe felt Daniel tense beside her, saw Evangeline's confused gaze flicking between them. We have separate suites, Daniel said carefully. We're both adults who value privacy and personal space. That doesn't make our marriage any less valid. And the financial arrangements? Mrs. Hopkins, are you employed outside the home? Do you have access to joint accounts, or are you financially dependent on your husband? Each question felt designed to expose the cracks in their foundation, to prove that their marriage was exactly what Helena Morrison claimed, a legal convenience rather than a loving partnership. I'm currently between teaching positions, Zoe said, lifting her chin. Daniel and I are partners in every sense. We make decisions together about Evangeline's care, about household management, about our future as a family. I see. Miss Sterling made notes, her expression giving nothing away. Evangeline, sweetheart, could I speak with you privately for a few minutes, just you and me? No. The word came out sharp, definitive. Evangeline moved closer to Zoe, her small hand slipping into Zoe's larger one. If you want to ask me questions, you can ask them here. I don't have secrets from my family. Miss Sterling's eyebrows rose slightly at the child's mature response. All right. Can you tell me how you feel about living here with your uncle and Mrs. Hopkins? I love it here, Evangeline said simply. Miss Zoe helps me with my homework and reads me stories and doesn't think I should eat in the kitchen like the help. Uncle Daniel makes sure I'm safe and loved and never lets anyone make me feel like I'm a burden. They're my family now. What about before Mrs. Hopkins came to live here? How did you feel then? Evangeline's hand tightened in Zoe's. Sad. Lonely. Uncle Daniel tried really hard, but he was sad too, and he didn't know how to braid my hair or help me when I had bad dreams about Mama and Daddy. And now I'm not scared anymore. When I have nightmares, Miss Zoe comes and tells me stories about brave earth tears until I feel better. When Uncle Daniel has to travel for work, Miss Zoe stays with me, and we have adventures in the garden. They love each other, and they love me, and that makes me feel safe. Out of the mouths of babes. Evangeline's simple honesty was more powerful than any legal brief, more convincing than any careful explanation about their unconventional beginning. Miss Sterling made more notes, then looked up at Daniel and Zoe. I'll need to conduct separate interviews with each of you, speak with staff members, and review financial and medical records. The process typically takes several weeks. Of course, Daniel said. We'll cooperate fully with whatever you need. There is one more thing. Miss Sterling's expression grew more serious. Mrs. Morrison has requested that Evangeline be placed in temporary foster care during the investigation period. She's argued that allowing the child to remain in a potentially unstable environment could be harmful to her emotional development. No, Evangeline's voice was small but fierce. No, I won't go. You can't make me. This is my home. The little girl's distress was palpable, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Zoe immediately knelt beside her, pulling her into a protective embrace. Sweetheart, breathe. Just breathe. No one is taking you anywhere tonight. She looked up at Miss Sterling over Evangeline's head. Surely removing her from the only stable home she's known since her parents died would be more traumatic than allowing her to stay during the investigation. That's my assessment as well, Miss Sterling said, and Zoe felt a flicker of hope. However, I do need to establish some ground rules. There will be unannounced visits, and I'll need to observe family interactions in natural settings. Any significant changes to your living situation or relationship status must be reported immediately. Understood, Daniel said. Miss Sterling gathered her papers and stood. I'll be in touch within the next few days to schedule formal interviews. In the meantime, I encourage you to maintain normal family routines. Children are remarkably perceptive about adult stress, and Evangeline's emotional stability is my primary concern. After she left, the three of them sat in the parlor in stunned silence. Evangeline was still pressed against Zoe's side, her small body trembling with residual fear. They're trying to break us apart, she said quietly. Helena wants to take me away from you. That's not going to happen, Daniel said firmly, moving to sit on Evangeline's other side. I promise you, sweetheart, whatever it takes, whatever I have to do, you're staying right here with us. But what if they say your marriage isn't real? What if they think Miss Zoe is just pretending to love me? Evangeline looked between them with ancient, worried eyes. What if they can prove you're lying about being a family? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Daniel and Zoe looked at each other across Evangeline's head, the weight of their deception suddenly crushing. Because the truth was, their marriage had begun as an arrangement. The truth was, they had separate bedrooms and careful boundaries, and a relationship built on mutual need rather than organic love. The truth was, no matter how much their feelings had evolved, they were still vulnerable to exactly the kind of legal challenge Helena Morrison was mounting. We're not lying about being a family, Zoe said carefully. Love doesn't always start the same way for everyone. Some people fall in love at first sight. Some people grow to love each other over time. What matters is how we feel now, how we treat each other now, how committed we are to staying together now. But you don't share a bedroom like married people do, Evangeline said with the blunt honesty of childhood. I heard Miss Sterling asking about it. I know it's important somehow. Daniel and Zoe stared at each other, both understanding the impossible position they were in. How could they explain the complexity of their arrangement to an 8-year-old? How could they make their marriage look more conventional without crossing boundaries they'd carefully established? Sometimes married people need their own space, Daniel said finally. It doesn't mean they love each other less. But the social worker doesn't believe that, does she? Evangeline's voice was small, defeated. She thinks you're pretending to be married to keep me, and Helena thinks I'd be better off with her in Seattle, and everyone thinks they know what's best for me except the people who actually love me. The pain in her voice broke something in Zoe's chest. This child had already suffered too much loss, too much uncertainty. The idea that adults were fighting over her like a prize while causing her additional trauma was unbearable. What if we moved into the same room? The words were out of Zoe's mouth before she could stop them. What if we made our marriage look more traditional? Daniel's eyes snapped to hers, wide with surprise and something that might have been hope. You'd do that? He asked quietly. Share a room, share a bed, even though it would complicate everything we've carefully structured, even though it would blur the lines we've drawn between business and personal? Zoe looked at Evangeline's hopeful face, then at Daniel's carefully guarded expression. Yes, if it helps us keep Evangeline, if it makes our family look more convincing to people who don't understand what we've built here. Yes, but what about your privacy, your independence? Daniel's voice was rough with emotion. I won't ask you to sacrifice your comfort for legal strategy. You're not asking, I'm offering. Zoe stood, decision crystallizing in her mind. We started this marriage as partners, Daniel. Partners adapt to changing circumstances. Partners do whatever it takes to protect the people they love. Evangeline threw her arms around Zoe's waist, her face bright with relief. So you'll really stay together? Really be married like other parents? We'll really stay together, Zoe confirmed, meeting Daniel's gaze over the child's head. Whatever it takes, sweetheart. We're a family, and families stick together. As they tucked Evangeline into bed that night, Zoe wondered what she'd just committed herself to. Sharing a bedroom with Daniel Hopkins meant sharing more than just physical space. It meant sharing vulnerability, intimacy, the kind of closeness that could either strengthen their growing bond or destroy it completely. But watching Daniel kiss Evangeline goodnight, seeing the love and fierce protectiveness in his eyes, Zoe knew she'd made the right choice. Some things were worth the risk. Some battles were worth fighting, no matter the personal cost. And Evangeline Hopkins was definitely worth both. Chapter 9. The Search. Evangeline vanished with the morning mist, leaving only a hastily scrawled note and 2 hearts shattered by a child's desperate logic. Zoe found the letter on Evangeline's perfectly made bed, propped against her favorite stuffed elephant, the one that had belonged to her mother. The sight of those careful 8-year-old letters made her stomach drop even before she read the words. Dear Uncle Daniel and Miss Zoe, I heard you talking about the social worker and how she thinks you're pretending to be married. I know you're both trying to help me, but I don't want you to have to lie anymore because of me. If I go away by myself, then Helena can't take me to Seattle and you can stop pretending and be happy. I'm going to stay with the roses Mama and I planted so she can find me. Don't worry about me. I'm very good at taking care of myself. I love you both very much. Please, don't be sad. Evangeline. The letter fell from Zoe's nerveless fingers as she spun toward the open window, its gauzy curtains billowing in the early morning breeze. She could see the garden from here, but the gazebo where the memorial roses grew was hidden behind a stand of ancient oaks. "Daniel!" Her voice cracked as she called for him, the terror in her tone bringing him running from their shared bedroom, the room they'd been sharing for 3 days now, carefully maintaining appropriate boundaries while presenting a united front to the world. "What's wrong?" He appeared in the doorway, still in his pajama pants and undershirt, his hair mussed from sleep. "She's gone." Zoe handed him the letter with shaking hands. "Evangeline is gone." Daniel's face went white as he read their niece's heartbreaking explanation. "How long? When did you last see her?" "Last night at bedtime. I checked on her around midnight. She sometimes has nightmares when she's stressed." Zoe was already moving, grabbing clothes from Evangeline's dresser with frantic efficiency. She was sleeping peacefully. This note. "Daniel, what if someone took her? What if Helena—" "No." Daniel's voice was sharp with certainty. "This is Evangeline. She's 8 years old, but she's been making adult decisions since her parents died. She heard us discussing strategy last night, heard us worrying about the investigation, and she decided to solve the problem herself." The devastating accuracy of that assessment hit Zoe like a physical blow. They'd been so focused on presenting a convincing marriage, on protecting Evangeline from the legal battle, that they'd forgotten how perceptive she was, how much she understood about the adult world that was fighting over her future. "The roses," Zoe whispered, remembering the letter. She said she was going to stay with the roses she planted with her mother. They ran through the house like people possessed, calling for Augustus and Serafina, alerting the groundskeeping staff, spreading out across the estate's vast gardens. The memorial rose garden was empty, but Zoe found fresh footprints in the soft earth around the gazebo, small sneaker prints leading away from the roses toward the wooded area beyond the formal gardens. "She went into the woods," Daniel said, his voice tight with controlled panic. "There's hundreds of acres back there, old growth forest that connects to the state park. She could be anywhere." "We need to call the police," Zoe said, but Daniel was already on his phone. "I'm calling my security team first. They know these woods, know the property better than local law enforcement." His fingers flew over the screen. "Then we'll call the police, but Zoe, if word gets out that we've lost her, if this becomes public—" He didn't need to finish. Helena Morrison's lawyers would use Evangeline's disappearance as proof that Daniel and Zoe were unfit guardians. The fact that she'd run away because she'd overheard their private conversations about the custody battle would only make it worse. "I don't care about the legal implications," Zoe said fiercely. "I care about finding her before she gets hurt or scared or lost beyond our reach." Daniel looked at her with an expression of profound gratitude and something deeper. "You really do love her." "Of course I love her. She's my daughter now, in every way that matters." The words came out raw, honest, stripping away the last pretense between them. "Daniel, if something happens to her—" "Nothing is going to happen to her." He pulled Zoe against his chest, holding her tight for just a moment. "We're going to find her, bring her home, and then we're going to prove to every social worker and lawyer and judge in Georgia that this family is real." The next 6 hours passed in a blur of searches and phone calls and rising terror. Daniel's security team arrived within 30 minutes, followed by local police and eventually K9 units from the county sheriff's department. The woods that had always seemed like a peaceful refuge now felt like a threatening maze of hiding places and potential dangers. Zoe found herself paired with Officer Martinez, a young mother who understood the particular horror of a missing child. They searched the creek beds and hidden clearings, calling Evangeline's name until their voices were hoarse. "Smart kid," Officer Martinez observed as they examined a candy wrapper that might have been dropped by their missing girl. She's staying near water sources, moving away from the search parties. If she didn't want to be found, we might not find her until she's ready." "She's 8 years old," Zoe said desperately. "She can't survive out here indefinitely." "No, but she can survive longer than most kids her age. Kids who've experienced trauma, who've had to grow up fast. They develop survival instincts that serve them well in crisis situations." Officer Martinez's voice was gentle but realistic. "The question is whether she'll come home on her own when she gets hungry and scared, or whether she's determined to prove some point to the adults in her life." As afternoon stretched toward evening, Zoe began to understand that Evangeline might be proving exactly that kind of point. This wasn't a panicked flight or a childish tantrum. This was a calculated decision by a little girl who'd heard too much adult conversation about sacrifice and pretense and legal strategy. Evangeline had run away to save the people she loved from having to lie for her sake. "We need to think like her," Zoe said suddenly, stopping in the middle of a game trail. "She's not lost, she's hiding. She chose to leave, chose where to go. Where would an 8-year-old go if she wanted to feel close to her parents?" Officer Martinez nodded approvingly. "Good thinking. What was special to her about her parents? Where did they spend time together?" Zoe closed her eyes, thinking about all the stories Evangeline had shared over the past month. The rose garden, yes, but that had been too obvious. The old oak swing where she'd been sitting the day they first met. The music room where her mother had taught her piano. And then she remembered the old tree house. Evangeline had mentioned it once, almost in passing, when they'd been exploring the grounds together. Her father had built it the summer before he died, high in an ancient oak at the very edge of the property. It had been their secret place, she'd said, where they'd go to read books and tell stories and plan adventures. "I know where she is," Zoe breathed, already turning toward the eastern boundary of the estate. They found her just as the sun was setting, a small figure curled up in a treehouse that was little more than a platform and a roof among the branches. She'd built a careful nest of blankets and had a backpack full of snacks and water bottles, clearly planning for an extended stay. "Evangeline," Zoe called softly from the base of the tree. "Sweetheart, it's time to come home." A small face appeared at the edge of the platform, tear-stained but determined. "I'm not coming home. I'm staying here with Daddy's treehouse until Helena gives up and you and Uncle Daniel can stop pretending." "The only thing we've been pretending is that we're not scared," Daniel said, appearing beside Zoe with relief written across every line of his face. "We've been pretending we're brave enough to fight for our family without help from an 8-year-old superhero." "I'm not a superhero," Evangeline said, but her voice wavered slightly. "You're our superhero," Zoe said firmly. "You're brave enough to climb trees and smart enough to pack snacks and loving enough to sacrifice yourself for the people you care about. But you know what? Heroes don't always have to save the day alone. Sometimes heroes need to let other people help them," Daniel added. "Sometimes the bravest thing a hero can do is come home and let the people who love her fight the battles she's too young to handle." Evangeline was quiet for a long moment, thinking it over with the gravity of someone far older than her years. "If I come home, will you stop having sad talks about social workers and lawyers where you think I can't hear?" she asked finally. Zoe and Daniel exchanged glances. "How did you promise an 8-year-old that you'd shield her from the reality of the legal battle being fought over her future?" "We'll try to have those conversations when you're not around," Daniel said honestly. "But Evangeline, we also need to trust you to understand that adult problems require adult solutions. Your job is to be 8 years old, not to solve custody disputes." "And our job," Zoe added, "is to love you and protect you and make sure you know that no matter what happens with lawyers or social workers or anyone else, you will always have a home with us. Even if Helena wins, even if she makes you give me to her." The question hung in the air like a sword. Daniel was quiet for so long that Zoe wondered if he was going to answer at all. "If Helena Morrison somehow convinces a judge that you'd be better off in Seattle," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion, "then Zoe and I will pack up this entire house and move to Seattle too, because you're not just my legal responsibility, Evangeline, you're my heart, and hearts don't get shipped across the country without their bodies." The little girl's composure finally cracked, and she began climbing down from the treehouse with tears streaming down her face. Zoe caught her as she reached the lowest branch, pulling her into a fierce hug that conveyed all the terror and relief of the last several hours. "I was so scared," Evangeline sobbed against Zoe's shoulder. "I thought if I stayed away, Helena would stop trying to take me, and you could be happy without having to worry about me." "Oh, sweetheart." Zoe felt her own tears falling freely now. "We could never be happy without you. You're not a burden or a problem to be solved. You're our daughter, and daughters don't make their parents happy by running away. They make their parents happy by coming home." Daniel wrapped his arms around both of them, and for a moment they stood in the gathering dusk like a real family, parents and child, united by love and fear, and the fierce determination to stay together no matter what the world threw at them. "Are we going to be okay?" Evangeline asked as they walked back toward the house, her small hand clasped tightly in Zoe's. "We're going to be better than okay," Zoe said, and realized she meant it completely. "We're going to be exactly who we're supposed to be, a family." As the estate's lights came into view through the trees, Zoe felt something settle in her chest that she hadn't realized had been loose and uncertain. Whatever happened with Helena Morrison, whatever legal battles lay ahead, they would face them together. Not as two people playing roles in a convenient arrangement, but as three people who had chosen each other and would keep choosing each other no matter what obstacles arose. A real family, built on love and honesty, and the kind of commitment that ran deeper than any legal document could define. Chapter 10. Love and Retribution. The courthouse steps gleamed like marble altars in the October sunlight, and Zoe Hopkins stood ready to fight for everything that mattered. 6 weeks had passed since Evangeline's midnight flight to the treehouse. Today, Judge Patricia Hendricks would decide whether their unconventional family deserved to stay together. "Remember," Daniel said quietly as they climbed the courthouse steps, "whatever happens in there, we tell the truth. All of it." Evangeline walked between them with her chin raised, looking far too young to be the center of such an adult battle. "I've been ready since I was 6, she said with matter-of-fact courage. "When Mama and Daddy died, I learned that sometimes you have to fight for the things you love most." Inside the courthouse, Helena Morrison sat with her legal team like a queen holding court. She was elegant, intelligent, and absolutely convinced that she knew what was best for everyone. Helena's attorney presented their case, a careful demolition of Daniel and Zoe's marriage that painted them as opportunistic strangers in a legal arrangement rather than genuine love. "Your Honor," Helena's lawyer concluded, "while Mr. and Mrs. Hopkins may care for the minor child, their relationship lacks the emotional foundation necessary for stable family life." Then it was their turn. Jasper Whitfield, Daniel's attorney, stood with quiet confidence. "Your Honor, the Hopkins family represents something far more valuable than convention. They represent choice. Mr. Hopkins chose to prioritize his niece's well-being over social expectations. Mrs. Hopkins chose to love a child who wasn't biologically hers. And Evangeline has chosen them right back." Rebecca Sterling, the social worker, delivered the most powerful testimony. "I've conducted extensive observations of the Hopkins family. While their marriage may have begun as a practical arrangement, what I've observed is a genuine partnership built on mutual respect, shared values, and deep love for their child. I recommend that Evangeline remain with Mr. and Mrs. Hopkins." During recess, Zoe found herself face-to-face with Helena Morrison. "You know this won't last," Helena said. Daniel is a Hopkins man. They marry for duty, not love. She'll be exactly where she belongs, Zoe replied steadily. In a home with people who chose to love her. Helena's composure cracked. Because Daniel will fail her, just like he failed Alexander. He was supposed to drive them that night. The raw pain in Helena's voice finally made everything clear. This wasn't about Evangeline's best interests. It was about punishing Daniel for a tragedy that had destroyed them all. Mrs. Morrison, Zoe said gently, holding on to that anger won't bring Lillian back, but it might cost you the only connection you have left to her memory. Don't make Evangeline pay the price for your grief. When court reconvened, Helena requested permission to address the court directly. Your Honor, she said, I'd like to withdraw my petition for custody. I realize that my motivations may have been more about my own grief than Evangeline's best interests. I would like to request regular visitation rights instead. Judge Hendricks nodded approvingly. Then this court awards permanent custody of Evangeline Hopkins to Daniel and Zoe Hopkins with scheduled visitation rights for Helena Morrison. Her gavel fell with finality. Case dismissed. Evangeline approached Helena with mature grace. Grandma Helena, I'd like to visit you for a weekend soon. Maybe you could teach me some of the songs Mama used to sing. Helena knelt to embrace her granddaughter with tears streaming down her face. I'd like that very much, sweetheart. Outside the courthouse, Daniel and Zoe found themselves alone. We did it, Zoe said simply. Zoe, about what Helena said. Stop. Zoe placed her fingers against his lips. I married you to escape humiliation. I stayed married to you to help Evangeline. But I'm staying married to you now because I'm completely, irrevocably, impossibly in love with you. Daniel's face transformed with hope and wonder. Thank God. Because I've been falling in love with you since the moment you told that ridiculous story about earth tears to comfort a frightened little girl. Their kiss was soft, full of promise and desperate relief. So what now, Mrs. Hopkins? Daniel asked. Now we go home and live as husband and wife who actually love each other, Zoe smiled. But first, there's something you need to take care of. Daniel's expression turned cold and calculating. Garrett Ashford and Nathaniel Cromwell are about to learn what happens when someone threatens my family. The revenge was swift and devastating. Garrett had been working with Nathaniel Cromwell to destabilize the Hopkins family. Within 24 hours, Garrett faced fraud charges for credit cards opened in Zoe's name, while Nathaniel's business clients mysteriously lost confidence and his loans were called in. That evening, as they sat in Daniel's study watching Evangeline play piano, Zoe asked, "How did you do all that so quickly?" "Money talks," Daniel said simply, "but justice talks louder." Evangeline appeared in the doorway. "Are you two being mushy again?" "Definitely," Zoe confirmed. "Come here, sweetheart, we have an announcement." Daniel cleared his throat formally. "Miss Evangeline Hopkins, Zoe and I have decided to stop pretending to be married and start actually being married instead." "Finally," Evangeline said with dramatic relief. "I was getting tired of pretending I didn't know you were already kissing when you thought I wasn't looking." "How long have you known?" Zoe asked, heat flooding her cheeks. "Since the night I ran away. When you found me, you looked at each other like Mama and Daddy used to, like you couldn't imagine being anywhere else." "So what happens now?" Evangeline asked. "Now we live happily ever after," Zoe said simply. "Real love, real marriage, real family." "Does this mean you're going to have babies?" Evangeline asked with childhood bluntness. "Because I think I'd like a little sister." Daniel choked on his coffee, and Zoe felt her face burn brighter. "Let's see how we do with the daughter we already have," she managed, smiling. As evening settled over the Hopkins estate, Zoe stood at the windows of their truly shared bedroom, watching the garden where she'd first met Evangeline. "Any regrets?" Daniel asked, wrapping his arms around her waist. Only one, Zoe said, leaning back against his chest. I regret that it took us so long to admit what we both knew from the beginning. What's that? That some of the best love stories start with the most practical of proposals. I need a woman, and you need a home. Zoe turned in his arms. Turns out, we both needed so much more than that. What do we need? Daniel asked softly. Each other, Zoe said simply. We need each other. We need Evangeline. We need this beautiful life we've built together from the ashes of our separate heartbreaks. Daniel kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of promises about their future. And somewhere in the distance, they could hear Evangeline playing piano, a gentle melody that sounded like home and happiness and love that was real enough to last forever. The billionaire had declared he needed a woman and she needed a home. What they'd found instead was something infinitely more precious, a family built on choice, strengthened by adversity, and sealed with the kind of love that transformed convenience into destiny. And they all lived happily, honestly, beautifully, ever after. The end.